I'm a 34-year-old guy who works in a physically demanding field. You know the type. Lifting, moving, long hours on your feet. It's not the kind of job where you'll find a lot of diversity in body types. My coworkers and I are all on the fitter side, whether it's from the work itself or personal workouts on the side. Now here's the thing. My wife Carol is fat. And she's always been fat, ever since the day I met her. When we started dating, she was fat. When I proposed to her, she was fat. When we walked down the aisle, she was fat. That's who she is, and I wouldn't change a single thing. Carol knows she's fat, and she's never had an issue calling herself that. She owns it. It's part of who she is, just like her humor, her kindness, and her sharp mind. To me, she's the most beautiful woman in the world, exactly as she is. If she ever wanted to lose weight, I'd support her. If she stays just like she is, I'm perfectly happy. It's her choice, and I love her no matter what. Now, one of my coworkers, Julia, is someone I thought I got along with. She's 28, fit, and health-obsessed. We'd had some deep conversations before about mental health, burnout from work, and some of the hardships of the field we're in. I thought we were friends, but that was until a few days ago when Julia started venting to me during a break. She said something that stopped me in my tracks. Fat people don't get to be loved. She wasn't even talking about my wife, just saying it in general, almost as if it were a fact. I was stunned. That's not true, I told her. My wife is fat. That's when everything started going sideways. Julia's face went red. Like, really red. She looked horrified and said, "You can't call your wife fat. That's so insulting." She started telling me how wrong I was for saying that, and how my wife must be curvy, not fat. Carol, however, doesn't like being called curvy. In her mind, it's a sugar-coated term people use when they're too uncomfortable to say fat. She's always said, why dance around it? It's just a descriptor. So I told Julia that, but Julia wasn't having it. She got this look on her face like she'd caught me in some awful act. She pulled out her phone and said, "I'm telling your wife you called her fat." Before she could message Carol, I beat her to it. I called Carol and put her on speakerphone. "Hey babe, quick question," I said. "Are you curvy or fat?" Carol's laugh came through the phone, bright and familiar. "I hate that curvy shit," she said. "Fat and beautiful, baby." I smiled. "Thanks, love. Just wanted to check. I love you." "Love you too. Talk later?" "Of course," I said and ended the call. As soon as I hung up, Julia lost it. She started yelling that I was abusing my wife. At first, I thought she was joking, but she was dead serious. According to her, I was brainwashing Carol into accepting the word fat to keep her from leaving me. Julia insisted that no woman in her right mind would be okay with her husband calling her fat. I didn't know whether to laugh or be angry. It was so ridiculous that it didn't seem real. I even showed her a picture of Carol wearing a shirt that had BBW across the front, something Carol had bought for herself and wore proudly. But that only seemed to make things worse. Julia stormed off, and from that moment on, things at work became weird. The next day, I walked into an email from HR requesting a meeting. I wasn't too worried. I had the conversation with my wife on speakerphone, the BBW shirt picture, and Carol's fat positivity blog if they needed proof. But the atmosphere at work had shifted. Julia started giving me cold looks whenever we were in the same room. She avoided me entirely otherwise. At the HR meeting, I found out it wasn't just Julia who had gone to them. Several of my coworkers had also reported the conversation. They didn't complain about me, though. They just wanted to give their side of what happened. I wasn't in trouble. HR just needed to hear my version of events. It turned out that Julia's reaction had caught everyone off guard. Some of the crew must have thought it was serious enough to warrant clarification, but they weren't accusing me of anything wrong. In fact, I got the impression that at least some of them thought the whole thing was absurd. After I told my side, the HR rep, a really nice woman, assured me that I wasn't in any kind of trouble. I offered to show Carol's blog, but she said it wasn't necessary. "If it's not affecting your work, it's not relevant," she explained. "The story has already been corroborated." However, she did offer me some advice. Even though Julia had initiated the conversation, I probably should have kept my nose out of it. It wasn't a reprimand, just a reminder to avoid personal topics like that at work. I agreed. I told HR that I'd thought Julia and I were friends. We'd had some pretty personal conversations before, but it was clear now that I'd misjudged the situation. Before the meeting ended, I brought up something I'd been thinking about: our workplace weight loss challenge. I suggested that if we wanted to avoid conversations about body image, maybe we should switch it to a fitness challenge instead. The HR rep seemed receptive and said she'd pass the idea along. When I left the meeting, I felt a little better, but the whole situation still sat heavy on my mind. Julia and I would no longer be paired on teams for patient care, which was probably for the best, but it hurt to realize that I had been wrong about our friendship. I finished my treatments for the day, keeping my head down and avoiding Julia whenever I saw her. She didn't speak to me, and I didn't try to initiate any conversation. I figured it was best to just stay out of her way. That night, when I got home, I told Carol everything. She listened patiently, then smiled. "People can be weird about fatness," she said. "Julia probably thinks she's doing me a favor, but she's just projecting her own issues." Carol had always been good at cutting to the heart of things. It made me feel better to know she wasn't upset or hurt by any of it. "You did good, babe," she said. "I love you." And that's really all that matters, isn't it? So now, things at work are a little chilly, and I've learned my lesson about mixing personal opinions with workplace conversations. But at the end of the day, I get to go home to my wife, the woman I love, exactly as she is. Fat and beautiful. And as I sit here typing all this out, one line from the movie Clue keeps running through my head. I'm gonna go home and sleep with my wife. And that's exactly what I'm gonna do. Over the next few weeks, things at work didn't get any easier. Julia's silent treatment continued, but the tension wasn't just between the two of us. It was clear that other coworkers had taken notice of the situation, and while no one openly said anything, the shift in the team dynamic was hard to ignore. People were careful around me now, as if they didn't know what might trigger another HR incident. Conversations that used to flow easily became stilted, reduced to polite small talk. Even my closest coworkers seemed hesitant to joke around the way we used to. It was exhausting, walking on eggshells every day. But the worst part was the way Julia's silent grudge spread like a contagion. A couple of her friends in the team followed suit, avoiding me or offering clipped responses when we crossed paths. I hadn't realized how much of a social hub Julia was until it felt like half the team was suddenly distant. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't logical. But it was happening. I could feel it wearing on me little by little. Every shift felt longer than the one before, and the once friendly atmosphere became heavy and uncomfortable. The only thing that kept me grounded was Carol. When I came home after those tough days, she always knew exactly what to say. She could sense the stress weighing me down, and she was my anchor through it all. "You did everything right." She would remind me when I ranted about the tension at work. "You stood up for me. For us. Some people just can't handle that. It's not on you." I tried to believe her. But some nights, as I lay awake next to her, I couldn't shake the feeling that this situation was far from over. About a month later, things took a darker turn. I started noticing whispers whenever I entered the break room. Conversations would abruptly stop, and a few coworkers would exchange looks. At first, I tried to shrug it off. I told myself I was imagining it, or maybe people were just cautious because of the HR situation. But then, one of the newer guys, Tim, pulled me aside. "Hey man," he said, glancing around nervously. "I just thought you should know, people are saying stuff." "Stuff like what?" I asked, dreading the answer. He hesitated as if he wasn't sure how to phrase it. "Julia's been telling people weird things about you and your wife, like that you're controlling her, manipulating her into thinking she's okay with being, fat," I supplied, with a humorless chuckle. "Yeah," he said, wincing. "She's been saying it's, like, emotional abuse or something, that you're gaslighting her into thinking she's happy when she isn't." I felt my stomach drop. This was worse than I thought. Julia wasn't just avoiding me, she was actively spreading lies. "Thanks for the heads up, Tim," I said, patting him on the shoulder. He gave me a sympathetic nod. "For what it's worth, I think it's all bullshit. But some people are starting to believe it." That night, I told Carol about the rumors. I hated dragging her into the mess, but I knew she deserved to know what was going on. Carol listened quietly, her expression growing more determined as I laid everything out. When I finished, she gave me a wicked grin. "Do you want to shut this down?" she asked. "Of course," I said. "But I don't know how. If I confront Julia directly, it'll only make things worse." Carol nodded thoughtfully, then reached for her phone. "I have an idea, but you'll have to trust me." I knew better than to doubt her. "What are you planning?" "You'll see," she said with a wink. The next day, Carol posted a new entry on her fat positivity blog. It was a long personal piece about self-acceptance, body image, and the power of reclaiming words that society uses to shame people. But the real kicker was the title, Fat, Loved, and Free. In the post, Carol shared her story, how she had always been fat, how she had fallen in love with me, and how she had never felt more beautiful or empowered than she did in our marriage. She wrote candidly about the challenges she faced in a world that constantly told her she was unworthy of love and respect because of her size. But the heart of the piece was a powerful message. I am fat. I am beautiful, and I am loved, deeply, completely, and without conditions. Anyone who thinks otherwise is projecting their own insecurities onto me. At the end of the post, she added a note directed at no one in particular, but sharp enough to sting. If someone thinks they need to rescue me from the life I've chosen, they don't understand what real love is. And that's their problem, not mine. The post went viral almost overnight. Carol's blog had a modest following, but this particular entry struck a chord with readers. It was shared across social media, gaining traction with communities that supported body positivity and self-love. Within a day, people at my workplace had found the post. I started noticing subtle changes, side conversations that stopped when I entered the room, coworkers glancing at their phones, and even a few apologetic looks from people who had been avoiding me. Julia, however, was not pleased. She stormed into the break room during one of my shifts, phone in hand, and slammed it on the table in front of me. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, her voice trembling with anger. I glanced at the screen. It was Carol's blog post, displayed proudly on her phone. "It's my wife's truth," I said calmly. "She's lying," Julia hissed. "You made her write this." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd that I couldn't help myself. "Julia, you really think I could make Carol do anything she doesn't want to do? You clearly don't know her." Before she could respond, Tim, my new favorite coworker, chimed in from the corner. "You need to let it go, Julia. Everyone's seen the post. No one's buying what you're selling anymore." Julia's face turned beet red, but she didn't say another word. She grabbed her phone and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. Things slowly began to return to normal after that. The whispers died down, and the awkwardness at work started to fade. Julia avoided me entirely, and I was more than happy to return the favor. A few weeks later, I heard through the grapevine that Julia had put in for a transfer to another department. Whether it was because of the fallout from her lies, or just a coincidence, I didn't know. And frankly, I didn't care. What mattered was that I still had the love of my life waiting for me at home. Carol, fat, beautiful, and unapologetically herself. Every time I think back on the whole ordeal, I feel a mix of frustration and gratitude. Frustration for the unnecessary drama Julia created, but gratitude for the reminder of just how lucky I am. Because at the end of the day, I get to come home to Carol. And that's all that really matters. And just like I said before, to quote Clue, I'm gonna go home and sleep with my wife. I feel like I'm about to get flamed, so throw away. This is not how I imagined things would turn out, but here we are. My girlfriend, Sophie, and I have been together for 3 years. We've built a lot together in that time. Routines, shared dreams, inside jokes, and traditions. One of those traditions is treating each other to dinner on our birthdays. We don't place any restrictions on how much the meal can cost. At least, that's how it's supposed to be. I guess I took that freedom a little too far this time, and now I'm stuck wondering whether I really messed things up for good. To give you some background, Sophie's pretty frugal. It's part of who she is. She grew up in a family that always had to pinch pennies, and it stuck with her. I grew up the opposite way. My parents weren't rich, but they believed in treat-yourself moments, an occasional expensive dinner, a vacation splurge, that kind of thing. So, when Sophie and I first started dating, we had to find a middle ground. It took us a while, but one of the things we agreed on early in the relationship was that for each other's birthdays, we'd go all out. No limits. Whoever's birthday it is gets to pick the place, and the other covers the bill. No questions asked. It felt like a way to show each other love without the usual day-to-day financial worries getting in the way. For her past birthdays, Sophie usually picks nice but reasonable places. Bistros, sushi spots, places where the final bill ends up somewhere between $100 and $150 for both of us. She doesn't drink alcohol, which helps keep costs down. At most, she'll order a mocktail or sparkling water. But she always insists I get whatever I want when I treat her. So I've never felt guilty about paying for both of us, even if the price was a little high. This year, it was my turn. My birthday was 2 days ago. I had been looking forward to it for weeks. Life has been stressful lately. Work has been crazy, and I've been feeling burnt out. All I wanted was to unwind and enjoy a night without responsibilities. And selfishly, I was counting on Sophie to understand that. I chose a nice steakhouse downtown. One I'd had my eye on for a while but couldn't justify visiting on a regular night. I knew it would be expensive, but hey, it was my birthday, and this was the one day I didn't have to feel guilty about it. Sophie didn't seem thrilled with the idea, but she agreed to the plan. The night started out fine. We got to the restaurant, and the place was beautiful. Dim lighting, candles on every table, waiters in crisp uniforms. I could tell Sophie was a little uncomfortable. She's not big on fancy places, and I think the whole vibe of the restaurant made her feel out of place. But I figured once we started eating, she'd relax. We ordered appetizers, and I went straight for the drink menu. The steakhouse had a cocktail selection that was hard to pass up. I knew Sophie didn't like me drinking. She thinks alcohol is a waste of money and always says she doesn't understand how anyone enjoys it. But this was my birthday. She promised to cover everything, so I didn't think twice about ordering what I wanted. My first drink was a bourbon-based cocktail with hints of smoked maple syrup. It was amazing, smooth and flavorful, and exactly what I needed to start the night. When the waiter came back, I ordered another one. Sophie shot me a look, but she didn't say anything. We talked a little while we waited for our food, though it felt a bit strained. I could sense her discomfort, but I tried to brush it off. When the entrees arrived, I ordered a ribeye, the biggest one on the menu. I'm a sucker for steak, and this was a once-a-year kind of thing. Sophie ordered something light, as usual, a salmon fillet with a side salad. By the time we finished our main course, I was on my fourth drink. I wasn't drunk, not even close. I have a high tolerance, so I was still fully present. But Sophie was starting to fidget. She kept checking her phone and glancing at the bill folder the waiter had left on the table, unopened. "You okay?" I asked her. She forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired." Dessert was next, and I decided to go for the full experience. I ordered the creme brulee and paired it with a dessert wine. Sophie declined dessert, but sat quietly as I enjoyed mine. I could tell she was counting the minutes. Still, she didn't complain, not once. I figured she knew the deal. It was my night, and I wanted to enjoy it. By the time the check came, I had downed 8 drinks. The bill was steep, around $310, including tip. I knew it was a lot, but that's the nature of high-end restaurants. I thought Sophie knew what she was getting into when she agreed to this, so I didn't worry too much about it. She paid the bill without a word. I kissed her on the cheek and thanked her for a great night. But everything changed the next day. At first, I thought Sophie was just tired from the late night. But as the day went on, she barely said 2 words to me. When I tried to ask if everything was okay, she brushed me off with short, clipped responses. It wasn't until that evening that things finally boiled over. I was sitting on the couch when she stormed into the room, her face tight with frustration. "Do you even realize how much you spent last night?" She snapped, crossing her arms. I blinked, taken aback by the sudden anger. "Yeah, but we agreed to cover each other's birthday dinners, right? No limits." Sophie's eyes narrowed. 8 drinks, Mark. 8. Do you have any idea how ridiculous that is? "It was my birthday," I said defensively. "I wanted to enjoy myself." "And I get that," she shot back. "But you know I don't drink." I think alcohol is a waste of money, and you still ordered drink after drink without even considering how I felt about it. Her words stung. I tried to keep my cool. But that's the whole point of our tradition, right? You get to treat me, I get to treat you, no questions asked. She let out a frustrated sigh and sat down on the armrest of the couch. Mark, this isn't about the tradition. It's about respect. Do you know how hard I worked to save up for that dinner? I've been cutting back on things for months just to make sure I could afford a nice night out for you. And you just kept ordering drinks like money didn't matter. I stared at her, guilt creeping in. I hadn't thought about it that way. To me, it was just one night, a chance to indulge. But for Sophie, it had been a sacrifice. I didn't realize, I began, but she cut me off. That's the problem, she said, her voice quieter now but still full of hurt. You didn't even think about me. It wasn't just about the money, Mark. It was about you not considering how I might feel. I sat in silence, the weight of her words sinking in. She was right. I hadn't thought about her. I'd been so focused on enjoying my birthday that I hadn't stopped to consider how my actions might affect her. I'm sorry, I said softly. If it's that big of a deal, I'll pay you back for my part. Sophie shook her head. That's not the point. The point is, you took advantage of our tradition. And now, I don't even know if we can keep doing this. Her words hit me harder than I expected. I didn't want to lose what we had, our tradition, our bond. But I also knew things couldn't go back to the way they were. It's been 2 days, and Sophie still hasn't really talked to me. I offered to reimburse her again, but she waved me off, saying it wasn't about the money. I don't know what to do. Part of me feels like I was justified. It was my birthday, and I should be able to enjoy it. But another part of me knows I hurt her, and that's not something I can ignore. If I could go back, I'd do things differently. I'd be more mindful of how Sophie felt, more aware of the sacrifices she made for me. But I can't change the past. All I can do is hope we find a way to move forward, together. Only time will tell. The silence between Sophie and me grew heavier with each passing day. Every attempt to talk ended in cold responses or her walking away. I knew she was still hurt, wounded by more than just the financial aspect of the dinner. It was deeper than that. It was the realization that, on a night that was supposed to be special for both of us, I had only thought about myself. I wanted to fix things, but every time I tried, I felt paralyzed. How do you apologize for something you didn't even realize was a mistake until it was too late? And how do you repair trust when the damage wasn't just about money, but about neglect? After nearly a week of silence, I knew I had to do something. Avoiding the issue wasn't helping, and Sophie deserved more than empty apologies. I needed to show her that I understood, that I wanted to rebuild the trust I had broken. One evening, I texted her from the other room. Can we talk? I've been thinking, and I have an idea. A minute later, she appeared at the door, her arms crossed. What do you want to talk about? I swallowed the knot in my throat. Look, I know I messed up. I was selfish. I didn't think about how much that dinner cost you or how it made you feel. But I've been thinking, maybe we should change our tradition. Her eyebrows furrowed, but she didn't say anything, so I pressed on. Instead of just treating each other to these big, expensive meals, what if we do something more meaningful? Like for our birthdays, we plan experiences we both enjoy, something thoughtful instead of just food. She stared at me, her expression unreadable. You mean like, no more restaurants? Not exactly, I said quickly. We could still go out, but maybe it's not just about splurging. Maybe it's about doing something that matters to both of us. A day trip, a picnic, a cooking class, whatever feels special. Something we can enjoy together. She hesitated, her gaze softening. I could see she was considering it, but the hurt was still there, just beneath the surface. So, you're saying you don't care about the fancy dinners anymore? I shook my head. I care more about us. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time in days, I saw a flicker of warmth in her eyes. I'll think about it, she whispered. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The days that followed weren't perfect, but Sophie seemed to open up a little more. We started talking again, small conversations at first, then gradually easing back into our usual rhythm. I noticed how guarded she still was, but I tried to be patient. I knew earning back her trust would take time. One Sunday afternoon, I decided to make the first move toward our new tradition. Sophie loved nature, so I suggested we go for a hike at a nearby trail she had been talking about for months. When I pitched the idea, she gave me a skeptical look. A hike? You're not exactly the outdoorsy type. I smiled. True, but I figured it could be fun. And it's not about me. It's about spending time with you. That was the first time I saw her really smile in days. We went on the hike the following weekend, and it was exactly what we needed. The fresh air, the quiet moments, the way the trail forced us to walk side by side, talking about things that had nothing to do with money or birthdays. It felt like we were rebuilding something that had been cracked but not broken. At the summit, Sophie looked out at the view and let out a deep breath. I think I'm ready to move past it, she said quietly. I just needed to feel like you understood why I was upset. I nodded, standing beside her. I get it now, and I'm sorry it took me so long. She slipped her hand into mine, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a sense of peace between us. When Sophie's birthday came around a few months later, I knew exactly what to do. Instead of booking a reservation at a restaurant, I planned a small surprise. I rented a cozy cabin an hour outside the city. Nothing too extravagant, just a quiet place where we could unwind. I packed a basket with her favorite snacks, some candles, and a few board games, and we drove out for the weekend. That night, as we sat by the fireplace sipping on hot chocolate, Sophie turned to me and smiled. This is perfect. She whispered, "Thank you." In that moment, I realized something important. Traditions aren't about how much you spend or what you do. They're about the love and thought you put into them. And for the first time, I knew we had created a tradition that truly belonged to us. The steakhouse incident still lingers in the back of my mind, but it no longer feels like a wedge between us. Instead, it's a reminder, a lesson in thoughtfulness and compromise, in learning to see things from someone else's perspective. And as we sat together in the glow of the fire, I knew that, whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. Because this was what mattered. Since then, Sophie and I have found a new rhythm. Our relationship feels stronger, more balanced. We've made room for each other's differences, and we've learned to talk things out instead of letting resentment build. The road wasn't easy, but it was worth it. And I know now that love isn't about grand gestures or expensive meals. It's about the little things, the thoughtful choices, the quiet moments, the willingness to grow together. And most importantly, it's about showing up for each other, every single day. Traditions can change, but love, that's the constant. And I think we're going to be okay. I, 55F, have been married to my husband, Greg, 63M, for 4 years now. It hasn't been an easy 4 years, though I thought it would be. Greg isn't my daughter Emily's biological father. He came into our lives much later, after my first marriage with Emily's dad ended in ashes. I hoped, with all my heart, that Greg and I could model a loving, stable relationship, something that had been missing from Emily's life for so long. But things have become more complicated than I ever imagined. Emily is 23 now, and while I love her, we have a complicated relationship. We've been through some heavy storms, and the past seems to linger between us, like a fog that won't lift. Emily was diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, DID, a few years ago. That diagnosis felt like both a revelation and a burden. A lens to understand her behavior, but also a reminder of the trauma she has carried with her since childhood. A lot of that trauma, she says, comes from watching the ugly deterioration of my first marriage, and from how I handled, or failed to handle, the bullying she endured in school. When Emily was younger, she was relentlessly bullied by her classmates. They made fun of everything, her clothes, her weight, and eventually her hygiene when she stopped taking care of herself because of depression. When she came to me for help back then, I didn't know what to do. In my eyes, children are innocent. I told her that if I intervened, I'd be an adult harassing children. I thought I was doing the right thing, but looking back, I can see how that logic failed her. She needed an advocate. She needed someone to stand up for her, and I didn't. The bullying escalated, and the kids at school called her trash. They'd taunt her in the halls, and Emily, already in the throes of depression, just stopped caring. Her hygiene deteriorated, and she came to me sobbing, asking for help. Part of me thought I was helping when I told her to take a shower and bought her new clothes. But to Emily, it felt like I was placing the blame on her for how others treated her. And even though the bullying ended with the suspension and expulsion of the ringleaders, she never forgave me. She keeps reminding me of how the school nurse once told her, "If you were my kid, you'd have permission to punch back if no one did anything." Those words, spoken by a stranger, stuck with her far more than anything I ever said. When Emily graduated from high school, she moved out and tried to carve out a life for herself. But it didn't go as planned. Mental health challenges followed her, and between therapy sessions, medication adjustments, and the stress of balancing college, she struggled to stay afloat. That's when I suggested she move back in with Greg and me. I thought it would be a chance for us to rebuild our relationship, to heal old wounds, and to give Emily a stable environment while she finished school and found a job. What I didn't anticipate was how poorly she and Greg would get along. Emily is an introverted, creative soul who loses herself in books, drawing, and other forms of escapism. She values solitude, especially when eating. Greg, on the other hand, is a social eater. He likes company. He didn't understand why Emily got irritated when he sat across from her at the kitchen table if she was eating alone. She once said she deliberately ate at odd hours to avoid conversation, but Greg didn't take the hint. The tension between them built slowly, like a kettle on a low boil. Over time, I started noticing that Greg was pulling away from me emotionally and physically. When I asked him about it, he dodged the question, saying he was stressed about work, but something felt off. Meanwhile, Emily became increasingly uncomfortable around him. She said his eyes lingered on her for too long, and when she confronted him about it one evening, everything erupted. There was shouting, doors slamming, and a kind of rage in Emily that I hadn't seen before. That night, after Emily stormed to her room, Greg finally confessed to me, "I'm attracted to her." I felt the ground drop out from beneath me. His words were like a cold slap to the face, shocking, disgusting, and heartbreaking all at once. He went on to say that being around her all day was hard for him, that she was walking temptation. And as if that wasn't painful enough, he admitted that the reason he had been distant with me was because of his attraction to her. "That's why I've been avoiding sex with you," he said. I was frozen. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to process any of it. All I knew was that the situation had become unbearable. I didn't blame Emily for any of this. How could I? She didn't ask for Greg's inappropriate thoughts. But having both of them under the same roof was tearing me apart. Something had to give. The next morning, I sat Emily down. I told her about Greg's confession, not in detail, but enough to explain why the tension in the house had become too much for me to bear. I assured her that I didn't blame her, but I needed time to figure out whether my marriage was even worth saving. I told her I would give her some money to stay at an extended stay hotel and that she could access her college's emergency housing resources. I wanted her to have space, too, a safe place away from all this chaos. Emily didn't take it well. She looked at me like I had just betrayed her all over again. "You're choosing him over me," she said, her voice shaking with anger and hurt. I tried to explain that I wasn't abandoning her, that I was just overwhelmed and needed time to process everything. But my words fell on deaf ears. She stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. The next thing I knew, my ex-husband was all over social media, painting me as the worst mother imaginable. He said I had kicked Emily out, that I had chosen my perverted husband over my own daughter. People started sending me nasty messages, calling me a monster. I feel trapped. I'm drowning in guilt, shame, and confusion. I don't know how to fix this. Emily won't talk to me, and Greg's confession has left a gaping hole in my heart. I don't even know if I want to stay married to him after this, but I also don't want to abandon everything we've built together over the last 4 years. I lie awake at night, replaying everything in my mind. The bullying, the broken promises, the failed attempts to be the mother Emily needed. I wonder if there was ever a moment when I could have made a different choice, taken a different path, and spared us all this pain. I tell myself that Emily is strong. She'll access her college's resources, find her way, and maybe, just maybe, we'll find a way to repair our relationship in the future. But right now, I need to figure out what to do with my marriage. I need to decide whether Greg and I have a future, or whether this revelation is the final nail in the coffin. I don't know how this will end. All I know is that I'm standing at a crossroads, with no clear path ahead. Every choice feels like the wrong one, and every step I take seems to hurt someone I love. But I have to keep moving. I have to figure out what comes next. For me, for Emily, and for whatever future we might still have together. Am I the villain here? Am I making the biggest mistake of my life? I don't know. All I know is that I'm doing the best I can with the broken pieces I have left. The silence after Emily left was unbearable. Every tick of the clock, every creak of the house felt heavy with her absence. Greg stayed in the living room, avoiding me as if we were strangers forced to share the same space. I kept expecting Emily to call, to text, to say something. But days passed, and there was nothing. I thought about reaching out to her, but every time I picked up the phone, my hands would tremble. What could I even say? I knew that she must feel betrayed and abandoned, and any attempt to justify my decision would probably feel like pouring salt on the wound. The truth was, I didn't know if I had done the right thing. I told myself that I needed space to think, but the silence in the house only made my thoughts louder. I replayed Greg's confession over and over in my head, feeling sick to my stomach every time I heard the words, "walking temptation." How could I ever look at him the same way again? How could I sit across from him at the dinner table, knowing what he had admitted? I tried to talk to Greg a few days after Emily left. I needed answers to questions I wasn't even sure how to ask. "I can't stop thinking about what you said," I told him one evening, my voice trembling with barely contained frustration. "Do you even realize how much you've hurt me? How do you expect me to trust you after this?" Greg sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I never acted on it, okay? I told you because I thought being honest was the right thing to do." "Honest?" I echoed bitterly. "You think telling me you're attracted to my daughter is honest?" He threw his hands up in frustration. "What did you want me to do? Pretend everything was fine? I was trying to be transparent." "Transparent?" I snapped, my voice rising. "You don't get a medal for transparency when you're telling me you've been fantasizing about my daughter." Greg sat down on the edge of the couch and buried his face in his hands. For a moment I thought he might cry. "I didn't want this to happen," he whispered. "I love you, I really do. But being around her every day, it was just hard." I felt the anger bubbling up again. But this time, it was mixed with something else. Grief. The man sitting in front of me was not the same person I thought I knew. A week passed, and the weight of Emily's absence grew heavier. I checked her social media compulsively, looking for any sign that she was okay. She posted sporadically, vague, cryptic messages that only made me worry more. Once, she posted a black and white drawing of a woman standing on the edge of a cliff surrounded by shadows. The caption read, "Some bridges were meant to burn." I knew that was meant for me. The comments were filled with sympathetic messages from her friends, and of course, from my ex-husband. He was feeding the flames, painting me as the villain to anyone who would listen. I saw post after post from him, calling me a traitor, a coward, and worse. And the worst part was, people believed him. I stopped reading after a while. It was too much. Every night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Greg slept beside me, though we hadn't touched each other since that night. The space between us felt like an ocean, wide, cold, and impossible to cross. I kept telling myself that I had done the only thing I could. I couldn't throw Greg out of the house, not without first deciding if our marriage was worth saving. And I couldn't let Emily stay, not when the situation was so volatile. But no matter how many times I tried to justify it, the guilt gnawed at me. What kind of mother sends her daughter to a hotel? What kind of mother chooses her husband over her child? I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. Maybe I should have left instead, found a way to stay with Emily while we figured things out. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't have solved anything. The problem wasn't just about physical space. It was about trust. And that trust had been shattered. Between Emily and me, between Greg and me, between all of us. 2 weeks after Emily left, I got a call from her therapist. My heart pounded as I answered, fearing the worst. Hello, Mrs. Thompson, the therapist began gently. I wanted to reach out because Emily mentioned that you two had a falling out recently. She's safe, but I think it's important that we talk. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. How is she? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She's struggling, the therapist admitted. She feels very hurt and abandoned. But more than anything, she feels like she's been silenced. She said she doesn't feel heard, not just now, but throughout her life. Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. Silenced. That's how Emily had always felt. Like her pain didn't matter. Like her voice didn't count. And now, I had silenced her again by sending her away. I don't know what to do, I confessed, tears welling in my eyes. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought giving her space would help. The therapist paused for a moment before speaking again. Sometimes space is necessary, but it's also important to let her know that you're still there for her, even from a distance. She needs to know that you're willing to listen. Really listen. That night, I sat down and wrote Emily a message. I didn't know if she would read it, but I had to try. Emily, I know I hurt you, and I'm so sorry. I thought I was doing the right thing by giving us both space, but I see now that it only made things worse. You are not a burden to me, and I never wanted you to feel like you were. I love you more than words can say, and I'm here whenever you're ready to talk. I can't change the past, but I want to be better for you. Please know that I'm trying, even if I don't always get it right. I'm here, Emily. I'm here. I hit send and stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I didn't expect an immediate response. Maybe not even any response at all, but at least I had said what needed to be said. The days that followed were agonizingly slow. I checked my phone constantly, hoping for a reply. And then one evening, it came. A simple message from Emily. I'm not ready to talk yet, but thanks. It wasn't much, but it was something. A flicker of hope in the darkness. I knew that our relationship wouldn't heal overnight. There was still so much to unpack, so many wounds to mend. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we could find a way forward. And as for Greg, I still didn't know what the future held for us. But one thing was clear. I couldn't ignore what had happened. Whether our marriage survived or not, I needed to confront the truth about him, about myself, and about the choices that had led us here. For now, though, I would take it one step at a time. Because sometimes, that's all you can do. One step at a time. My ex-husband and I share a 13-year-old daughter named Nicole. Raising her has been a challenge, one that has shaped every decision we've made since the day she was born. Nicole has several medical conditions, neurological, developmental, and physical. She will always require some level of assistance in every aspect of life, from therapy appointments to personal care. Even with an aide who helps a few days a week, there's still so much that falls on us. This isn't just parenting. It's navigating a life that revolves around routines, schedules, and constant caregiving. The reality of Nicole's condition became clear when she was around 2 years old. The specialist told us the truth we didn't want to hear. This wasn't something Nicole would outgrow, and her care needs would only increase with time. It wasn't just a diagnosis. It was a life sentence, for all of us. At that point, my ex and I agreed we wouldn't have any more children. We knew our limits. Raising Nicole demanded so much from us that having another child would only lead to someone being neglected. Whether it was Nicole or a second child, we didn't want to create a situation where one of them lost out. Even with all the precautions we tried to take, things between us began to unravel. We loved each other once, but our relationship was eroded by exhaustion and resentment. After a lot of difficult conversations and even more difficult nights, we finally divorced when Nicole was 5. We settled on 50-50 custody. It wasn't ideal, but it was the fairest way to split the responsibility, and we wanted Nicole to feel loved by both of us equally. For a while, things were stable. Then, 3 years after the divorce, my ex remarried. His new wife, Callie, was nice enough, pleasant, polite, and friendly. But from the beginning, it was obvious she didn't understand the weight of Nicole's care. I figured it was natural. No one could grasp the full reality of raising a medically complex child without living it day to day. There's a learning curve, I told myself. But Callie's learning curve flattened fast. Over time, she made it clear that she preferred to be hands-off when it came to Nicole. At first, I thought it was just nerves, but soon it became obvious. She wanted to focus on her own life, not on the complicated responsibilities of co-parenting a special needs child. I wondered how this arrangement would work long-term, especially since Nicole was with them half the time. But it wasn't my household, so I let it go. I figured my ex could manage. After all, he was Nicole's father. He'd been in this with me from the start. Surely he wouldn't let her down now. About a year ago, everything changed again. My ex and Callie had a baby, a boy named Liam. I was surprised, to say the least. My ex had been so adamant for years that having more children was out of the question. He understood the difficulties and was always firm that our focus had to remain on Nicole. So when I heard the news, I didn't know what to think. But it wasn't my place to pry. If they wanted to expand their family, that was their decision. It wasn't long, though, before the cracks started to show. My ex began calling me to vent more frequently. His life, which was once manageable despite its challenges, was now overwhelmed by the chaos of juggling 2 children. He told me that Nicole's appointments, therapies, and special care were hard to keep up with while also tending to a newborn. Callie, who had never been involved in Nicole's care, was now fully engrossed in the baby's needs and had little patience left for anything else. I tried to be empathetic. Parenting is hard under any circumstances, but parenting a child with special needs and a newborn at the same time? I could only imagine how exhausting it was. But what could I do? It wasn't as though I could make Nicole's needs disappear, and Liam wasn't going to stop crying just because they were overwhelmed. Over the next few months, the phone calls became more frequent and more desperate. My ex complained that Callie would get upset when he prioritized Nicole over the baby. There were arguments about therapy appointments, about who should stay up with the baby at night, about how unfair it was that Nicole demanded so much time. My ex was exhausted, frustrated, and above all, conflicted. He loved both his children, but it was clear that managing the needs of 2 very different kids was wearing him down. Then came the conversation I'd been dreading. One evening my phone rang and it was my ex again. I answered with a sigh, bracing myself for another vent session. But this time he wasn't just venting, he had a proposal. "I've been thinking," he began hesitantly. "What if Nicole stays with you more? Maybe full-time?" I sat in stunned silence for a moment. "What?" "I mean, it's just getting really hard with the baby," he said, his voice tired and heavy. "Callie's struggling. I'm struggling. It's too much." I could feel my anger bubbling beneath the surface. "Nicole is your daughter. You don't just get to hand her off when things get hard." "I'm not trying to abandon her," he said defensively. I don't know what else to do. Callie's upset because I took Nicole to her physical therapy appointment instead of helping her with the baby." I clenched the phone tighter. "Maybe you should have thought of that before having another kid." He went quiet on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was small and defeated. "Callie wanted a baby. And that's it?" I snapped. "That's your reason? We talked about this 10 years ago. We agreed that having more kids wouldn't be fair to anyone, least of all Nicole. Why did you think it would be different this time?" The silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, I said what I knew needed to be said, even if it hurt. "If you can't handle this, then we need to go back to court and adjust custody, because I won't let Nicole feel like a burden in her own father's house." Later that night, Callie called me, furious. "How dare you say that to him?" she hissed. "He's been crying all evening because of you, and you basically told him our baby shouldn't exist." "That's not what I said," I replied calmly, though my patience was wearing thin. "What I said is that you both didn't think this through. You brought another child into the mix without considering how it would affect Nicole. Or yourselves. You're such a jerk," she spat before hanging up. I sat there in the silence, my heart heavy with frustration and sadness. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I was trying to protect Nicole, the one person in all of this who had no say, no power, and no escape from the decisions the adults in her life made. The next few weeks were tense. My ex avoided calling me, and Callie stayed out of the picture entirely. I contacted my lawyer and began the process of adjusting the custody arrangement. As much as I wanted Nicole to have a relationship with her father, I needed to prioritize her well-being. If being with me full-time would give her the stability she needed, then that's what I had to do. I don't know what the future holds for my ex, Callie, or their new baby. But I do know one thing. Nicole will never feel like a burden, not while I'm around. Because at the end of the day, love isn't just about what's convenient or easy. It's about showing up, even when things get hard. Especially when things get hard. And I will always show up for Nicole. The decision to go to court wasn't easy, but I knew it was necessary. Nicole needed stability and care, not the feeling of being shuffled between households where she was resented or overlooked. When my lawyer filed the paperwork, I expected some pushback from my ex, but the silence that followed was deafening. For weeks, I heard nothing from him, not even a call to check on Nicole. It was as though the tension between us had built a wall too high for him to cross. Eventually, I received a court date. I wondered if my ex would fight me on the custody arrangement, or if he'd just agree to reduce his time with Nicole. I hoped that, at the very least, we could reach an agreement that kept things civil for Nicole's sake. But when I showed up at the courthouse, things were more complicated than I had imagined. My ex was there, looking tired and defeated, with Callie by his side. Callie's expression was tight, her lips pressed together like she was holding back words she wanted to spit. When we sat down with the mediator, my ex admitted he was struggling to balance Nicole's needs with the demands of caring for a baby. "I love Nicole," he said quietly, his eyes avoiding mine. "But things have been hard. Harder than I expected." I looked at him for a long moment, trying to see the man I used to know, the man who used to fight for his daughter, who once sat beside me in hospital waiting rooms, holding my hand while we waited for updates on Nicole's latest test results. But that man wasn't here. The person sitting across from me now was someone beaten down by life, looking for a way out. "I get it," I said finally. "It's hard. But you can't just opt out when it's inconvenient. That's not how this works." Callie let out a sharp sigh, folding her arms. "You act like we're monsters for having a baby. We didn't plan for things to be this hard, okay?" "No one plans for it," I said, meeting her gaze. "But we live with it. That's what being a parent is. You live with it, no matter how hard it gets." The mediator stepped in before things could escalate, guiding us back to the custody discussion. After hours of negotiation, we came to an agreement. Nicole would stay with me most of the time, but my ex would have visitation every other weekend and one evening during the week. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than the alternative. Months went by without much contact from my ex. He would see Nicole during his scheduled visits, but the calls between visits grew less frequent. I told myself it was just part of the adjustment, but deep down, it hurt to see him drift away from his role as Nicole's father. Then one night, just as I was settling in with Nicole to watch a movie, my phone buzzed. It was my ex. I hesitated before answering. "Hello?" I need to talk," he said, his voice shaky. "Can I come by?" I glanced at Nicole, who was curled up on the couch, focused on the TV. "Now? Yeah, it's important." Something in his voice made me say yes. I told Nicole I'd be right back and went to meet him outside. When I opened the door, I was shocked to see how worn down he looked. He was thinner, his eyes sunken with exhaustion. It was like he hadn't slept in days. "Are you okay?" I asked, concerned despite everything. "No," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not." He sat down on the steps of my porch and buried his face in his hands. "I messed everything up," he whispered. "Callie, she left." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "She took Liam and left last week," he continued, his voice cracking. "She said she couldn't handle it anymore, said I was spending too much time with Nicole and not enough with her and the baby." I sat beside him, stunned into silence. As angry as I'd been with him, I never wanted this. I knew how painful it was to feel like you were failing at both parenting and relationships. "What are you going to do?" I asked softly. He shook his head. "I don't know. I thought I could balance everything, but I was wrong. I hurt everyone." There was a long pause as we sat in the quiet night air. Finally, he looked at me, his eyes filled with regret. "I know I let you down, and I let Nicole down too." I didn't say anything right away. There were no easy answers. No words that could undo the damage that had been done. But as much as I wanted to stay angry, I also knew what it was like to feel completely lost. You can still be there for her, I said quietly. It's not too late. Over the next few months, my ex slowly began to rebuild his relationship with Nicole. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect. But he showed up, week after week, appointment after appointment. He made mistakes, but he owned them. And little by little, Nicole began to trust him again. As for Callie, she never came back. My ex eventually filed for divorce, and while the pain of losing his second family weighed heavily on him, he channeled that energy into being a better father for Nicole. It wasn't the life he had envisioned, but it was the one he had. And he was finally learning how to live with it. In the end, we found a rhythm. It wasn't the family we had dreamed of, but it was ours. Nicole had a father who was trying, a mother who would never stop fighting for her, and a future that, while uncertain, was filled with love. Because in the end, that's what mattered most. Not the perfect plan. Not the perfect family, just love, messy, complicated, imperfect love. And for Nicole, that was enough, and for me too.